Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. Brazil's president facing impeachment, perhaps proceedings beginning as early as next week. This as her coalition government falls to pieces. We're talking about it with Gabriel Zacharias of the University of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo, where a lot of this has been going on, of course, over the past couple of weeks, with the police intervention at the home of former President Lula. We're also with Gabriel Rocha Gaspar of the 18th of March movement squarely against impeachment, Virginie Jacobs-Berger of French business magazine Valeurs Actuelles, and welcome back from Washington, Juan Carlos Hidalgo of the Cato Institute. We were talking just before the break about how this is coming to a head, a perfect storm, if you will. Virginie, corruption. It's been on all sides in Brazil, as we said in part one of our discussion.
Sure.
Now, though, it's happening. It's involving, first of all, a state oil company, something that's familiar to a lot of our viewers in a lot of countries, including
and
France.
All people but all people gathering in the street actually two weeks ago was really in relation of the investigation on Petrobras, because this scandal is so huge. Of course, no one could deny that. Unfortunately, in Brazil, corruption rise everywhere. If you see the vice president, Michel Temer, he has also charged for corruption. But on this affair of pity that is just in an investigation since 2014, we already know that it's a colossal shame and grave corruption.
A few years back, Gabriel, the tide was high. Oil prices were high, commodity prices were high, Brazil's economy was booming. Did you see any of this coming?
There's always a crisis after economic expansion. Who knows the history of capitalism knows that. I think they should have prepared for that. Actually, yes, I did see that coming because it was a fable economic growth. But of course, we couldn't see all these political consequences coming. I think that's one of the things with corruption. Every time there is economic crisis, which is an impersonal process that's hard for people to grasp, we often use the scapegoat of corruption as an idea to say, the problem is that some people are stealing the money, and things that, unfortunately, are not that simple.
Right now we're in recession. What is it? Minus 3% projected for this year, minus 3.8% for 2015, the worst in decades. Without this recession, there wouldn't be these impeachment proceedings?
Maybe not, probably not. And also you have to remember inflation. Inflation is a very important thing because it reaches people, it reaches common people, especially because in Brazil we have a big informal sector, people that are not contemplated by labor legislation, so they don't have how to fight inflation.
Inflation reached 10%. At the same time, employment was almost the same figure. It's 9%. So, and you tell it before. It's true that it's the worst decade since decades and decades and decades. So it's really a critical moment for the economy since the last decade. And so a lot of economics said that it's kind of lost decade for Brazil. But I think the main point, it's not only the specter of decline, is that for Brazil, people are also very afraid of a lost decade going on. And that's a point, and that's the reason why people also go on the street.
Juan Carlos Hidalgo, do you agree? No 7.5% inflation, which is what's projected for this year. No Lava Jato scandal?
I think that there is a correlation. I think that Brazil is one of the few countries in the world where we can see that the inflation rate and the unemployment rate are at the same level as the popularity of the president. Because Dilma's popularity is around 10%. Unemployment is 9%, inflation is 11%. And the economy has been shedding, on an average, 100,000 jobs per month in 2015. Is expected to do the same this year. The deepest recession in 90 years. You know, somebody said once that when the tide is high, nobody knows who's naked and who's not in the sea. In this case, the fall of commodity prices has definitely exposed many of the problems that the Brazilian economy has been carrying for many years, and also has exposed the magnitude of the corruption scandal. I mean, people have less tolerance towards politicians and less tolerance to for corruption scandals. Look, this is not the first time that a Brazilian president has been impeached. Fernando Collor de Mello, in the early 1990s, was impeached also over corruption. He was impeached over corruption scandals, not cooking the books. So I think that this is not the first time that Brazil has been through this process, but certainly there is a correlation between the economic crisis, the corruption scandal, and the low popularity of President Dilma Rousseff.
Now, what about to the point that if she is forced from office, our panelists have been saying it, Juan Carlos Hidalgo, the vice president, he's no choir boy himself.
Well, the latest things I've read is that Michel Temer is trying to portray himself as the new Franco Itamar, who was the vice president who took over after Collor de Mello. He created a government of national unity. He implemented some economic reforms. Some economic reforms are badly needed right now. And as long as Dilma Rousseff is in power, those economic reforms are not going to be implemented. She needs to rally her base. And her base is a left-wing party that opposes austerity and opposes economic reforms. So as long as President Rousseff is in power, Brazil is going to continue in this deep recession, the deepest in 90 years. And I think that that's one of the reasons why she should go. Maybe not impeached by impeachment, but definitely through resignation.
If the vice president takes over, there could be a major change of direction for the Brazilian economy. The O Estado de Sao Paulo newspaper reporting Sunday that Michel Temer is already looking at ways to cut public spending and is considering sweeping welfare cuts in social programs. Cuts in social programs. Your reaction to that, Gabriel Rocha Gaspar?
That would be disastrous, actually. Because if we look at the scenario in which Brazil has been developing in the later years, actually it has been relying on that sort of agreement between bankers and, well, actually it was an agreement proposed by former President Lula that took Brazil to a state of win-win between the elite and the poor people. Actually, that was broken by the drop fall in the price of commodities, and then of course you couldn't keep that up. But I do not agree with Mr. Hidalgo when he says that she has a left-wing party, a left-wing base that is opposed to austerity. Actually, she has a right-wing base that has not been supportive at all in social programs or anything like that, because if we can remember that PMDB is, well, until today at least, in the base of the government. So actually what she didn't have was exactly a left-wing base that would keep her up with her street supporters, because there are street
But right now
supporters.
you'll agree that the Brazilian government just can't afford some of its social welfare programs.
Well, we could afford if we had some serious left-wing turns in the policy. For example, we do not tax fortunes in Brazil. Actually, the great fortunes we let it be, and we shouldn't
There's
let
no
it
wealth
be.
tax, is what you're saying.
No high wealth taxes. So that could be a means of getting more money to social programs. We shouldn't be cutting, actually.
So how could you explain that now, as a public opinion, it's only 8% for Dilma Rousseff, and actually the data for you, the last was 66% Brazilian people are for impeachment. So, you know.
Yeah, I believe there's a huge participation of the
result
media
of
in those figures, actually. Because Brazilian media is historically conservative. It belongs, 70% of communication in Brazil belongs to 5 families, which have a widespread along the whole country. And they simply do not, and they have never supported a left-wing coalition in power.
Yeah, but I think you couldn't deny reality. People gathering in the street was not the elite. It was all the people. And there's recently a report on Canal Plus, French TV, on favela. People were against also Dilma, and I don't think it was elite interview in the community, the favela, right?
There's a manifesto that was issued this week that is called the Manifesto of the Periferias, the Manifesto of the Outskirts of the Big Cities, which includes over 115 community organizations that are against impeachment. So, I mean, that's much more representative than a report in one favela, in one
Juan Carlos Hidalgo.
Just to put some numbers. Just to put some numbers on the fiscal crisis, Brazil currently has a fiscal deficit of 10% of GDP. That's huge. It went from being 2% in 2010 to 10% right now. Brazil spends over 10% of GDP on pensions, and we're talking about a country that is relatively young. So definitely some reforms on the spending side are needed. Brazil has spending, the spending as a percentage of GDP averages approximately 40%, which is enormous for a country of Brazil's stage of development. Taxes are already too high. We have a government whose tax intake is approximately 35% of GDP, which is also the highest in Latin America, for example. And according to the World Economic Forum, Brazil has the most onerous tax system in the world. It's the most complicated, and with the ones with the tax rates, one of the highest tax rates.
But organizations like the World Bank, have praised Brazil for lifting millions out of poverty on the beat of Lula and Dilma Rousseff.
And that was thanks to economic growth. And there are research that look into those years, and we can see that most of the economic growth, about 70% of the lifting of poverty during those years, had to do with economic growth. Some of it had to do with redistributive programs, for sure. But you cannot have redistribution if you don't have wealth creation first. And when an economy is contracting 3%, 4% a year, you definitely have to do something to start creating wealth, to start giving confidence to business people. And you don't do that by raising taxes in a country that already suffers from one of the highest tax rates in the world.
Yes, I would like to react to two things that Hidalgo said. One thing is important to remember that it's not entirely true to think that all the problem of the fiscal problems comes from expenses with social programs. We have to remember, for example, that Dilma had implemented a very important program of incentives of subsidies to the industry. For example, subsidizing the energy to make the cost of production, to lower the cost of production. And she had, with the adjustments she had implemented now in this mandate, she had to cut part of those incentives, and that's why, for example, the industry federation in São Paulo, where I come from, they are putting a lot of pressure against the government, and they're financing a lot of publicity against the government to promote impeachment because they are not happy with losing the incentives they got before. The second thing I would like to say is that Hidalgo had mentioned that I think that he had mentioned, it's good to put things in perspective. He had mentioned that Collor had already suffered an impeachment in 1992.
President Collor.
Yes, President Collor, that was the first president elected after the military dictatorship. But it's good to remember that the economic recession there was completely different. We had 1,700% of inflation. So
hyperinflation at the time.
Hyperinflation of the time, and that he was directly, as Hidalgo has pointed, he was directly involved in corruption scandals, differently from Dilma, who we can have a lot of assumptions if she knew about what she knew, what she didn't know, but actually she's not directly involved, and we're trying to impeach her, I repeat, based on fiscal allegations of fiscal responsibility.
Juan Carlos Hidalgo?
I happen to agree. Yeah, I happen to agree. If we look at Bolsa Familia, which is the most popular program, social program out there, it covers over a quarter of Brazil's population. Its cost is less than 2% of GDP. So that's certainly not where the big expenditure is. You have to look at pensions. Pension expenditure is over 10% of GDP. You have to look at public employment, and you have to look at corporate welfare too. You mentioned it. You know, you have the National Development Bank, BNDES, spending billions of dollars supporting all these construction companies and many big enterprises in Brazil. That's where big expenditure is, and I think that's where the focus should be when it comes to cutting spending in the public sector.
Gabriel Rocha Gaspar, just a word now on what's going to happen to Brazilian politics, because the story of Lula, the story of Dilma Rousseff, who fought the dictatorship and who get into trade unionism, and then they go into politics, and now these allegations, a lot of them are sticking. What's going to happen next in Brazil's politics?
Well, I'm no futurologist, but I may say nothing good can come out of. I don't see any scenario that might be good for Brazil in the outcome of that crisis. If Dilma stays, she doesn't have public support nor support within the government. Within the social bases that you mentioned, that constructed PT as a popular party, they are not supportive of Dilma anymore because of economic austerity that she's passed, because of an anti-terror law that is draconian and tends to criminalize social movements, because of her indications to some key cabinets, such as finances, that was a banker, and to agriculture, which was someone who's got farming lands that are way beyond imaginable. So I believe she's lost the street base, she's lost the political base, and if she's impeached, the government will be assumed by a group of people who are deeply involved in corruption. And I believe that if she lives with the campaign that has been issued by media against PT, I believe...
Are you suggesting that over 15 years, Brazil has grown, its economy, despite the recession of the last couple of years, has grown, but its institutions have not?
Yeah, actually, since the dictatorship, Brazil has not... we didn't have a rupture with the structure of the dictatorship. We didn't build institutions that are virally and vitally democratic. For example, we still have a military police. We still have an authoritarian kind of thought that remains within the political structure. And even if we check out, some of the figures that rule the country today are the same figures that used to rule in the time of the dictatorship.
Gabriel Zacarias, surely the Brazil of today is not the same as the Brazil under the dictatorship.
Yes, definitely not. But I see what he means. There's a lot that has remained in the institutions. That's because that was how the procedure of the transition from the military dictatorship to the democracy. It worked in a kind of pact where they try to avoid any kind of actual disputes, actual struggles between the two sides. So, for example, there was a general amnesty to people who were politically persecuted, but also to the militaries who were involved in torture. So it means that many of the people who were involved in the most atrocious activities of the military dictatorship, they are still in the institutions.
Virginie Jacoberger, are Brazil's institutions stronger or weaker today?
It depends. If you just think about the judicial part of institution, I think we could say that with the last affair and what it works well. But on the legislative part, it's true that we have to see what's going on. And so if the question is if impeachment is good for democracy or not, I think it's very difficult to answer that question right now, but the fact is that Brazil is just in a very critical moment, and that I'm quite sure that even after impeachment, Brazil will stay in a moment with a lot of turbulence, politic turbulence, and the economic part is quite a disaster. So there's a lot of things to do.
Juan Carlos Hidalgo, is Brazil a case unto its own? Or should we be connecting the dots with the pendulum swinging in Venezuela and Argentina, for instance?
When it comes to the economy, for sure, that we have seen the end of a cycle of macroeconomic populism again, where governments spend too much, then they incur into inflation, irresponsible fiscal policies, and that ended in crisis. We have seen that in Venezuela, we have seen that in Argentina, and now we're seeing it also in Brazil. I want to dwell on the subject of institutions. I would like to see this crisis as the glass being half full instead of half empty. Certainly, we have seen corruption cases being brought about also, or these charges being brought about in Argentina, being brought about in Venezuela against the ruling elite. But it's been in Brazil, where politicians, powerful politicians, former presidents, the Speaker of the House, have been actually indicted, have been actually charged of enriching themselves. And that has to do with a lot with the reforms that Brazil have been implementing in the last 15 years. Getting an independent judiciary, the way they choose their judges, the way they choose their prosecutors. This is a country that has engaged in deep reforms when it comes to institutions and the judiciary. So I think that Brazil has to be lauded about the way that this crisis is performing, because it's actually showing that the system works and that nobody is above the law.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. The clock has caught up with us. Juan Carlo Hidalgo, I want to thank you for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Gabriel Zacharias, Gabriel Rocha Gaspar, and Virginie Jacob Berger. Stay with us, though. Our Media Watch segment is next. So stay seated. Stay seated. Stay seated. James Creedon is here.
Hi, François.
The panel's ruling. They had more to say.
All right, well, they might have a chance to say more. We'll see. First of all, I mean, I don't speak Portuguese, so when I'm looking through social media in terms of trying to follow what's happening in Brazil, sorry, I have a major disadvantage. But there is one image that has been doing the rounds of social media over the last couple of weeks, and our Brazilian guests probably have already maybe anticipated which image it is. It was at one of the Dilma Rousseff anti-corruption protests, and as this headline in L'Express says, a photo that has reawakened the ghosts of a social and racial fracture or divide. And you can see there some of the protesters in the streets of, I'm not sure where that is, but the profile of the protesters tends to be more upper middle class. And the image itself, I'll show it to you now, is this. Now, what you see here is a couple protesting, you know, pretty, I suppose, bobo, you'd say in France. What would you say?
Bohemian.
Bohemian, there you go. And their nanny is pushing the kids along behind, and she is black. They are more or less not black. I don't know. In any case, it drew a lot of criticism. Poor Prakovnik Claudio, who was featured in that photo, ended up having to take to Facebook to say, hold on a minute, I'm earning an honest living, and I'm paying this lady above the average wage for a nanny. So I suppose it's not really his fault that the economic, I suppose, situation in Brazil permits one to have help in the home more regularly than you would have in Europe, for example.
Gabriel Zacharias, your reaction to that?
Yes, that was not what I was going to talk about, but that's okay. That's definitely very important. I think that's one of the major problems in Brazil. You have a big gap between the two sides of the population, the social pyramid, and it is still a racial segregation. You have to admit that, and that becomes obvious in all.
Brazil's never had a black president,
for example. Yeah. And when you take, for example, the numbers about the demonstrations, you have in that demonstration of that day, that's 13th March, right? March. That was, we had 4% of black people among the 500,000 people that were in São Paulo. So 4% of
so some of the criticism was you have these demonstrators who, in some ways, they're criticizing corruption, but they also represent the elites of Brazil, and they are protesting against corruption, but maintaining social inequalities. That's what that photo tended to sum up, even though the guy featured in it did a pretty honest job of defending himself.
Also, a lot of people against and saying for Dilma. You see that on the community. Right. I mean, community is a name in Brazil for favela. So we have done a lot of reports there to see also that these kind of people are also reacting against the government. So you couldn't say that it's just,
right.
You know, of course there's a gap in Brazil, and I think all the time. between the people, between the rich and the poor. But you couldn't say that the people who have been gathering against the government were just the elite or the bobo. It's really caricatural.
Some more photos to be even more caricatural. Some more photos showing inequalities
sure.
in Brazil. This is what you find these on. This is the problem with a photo. If it gets a huge viral sort of effect, then that's what you end up finding as soon as you type in certain keywords on social media. This was a photo taken in Sao Paulo.
That's south of Sao Paulo.
By Tuco Vieira, and he actually is unhappy at the degree to which this photo has now kind of gone beyond or gone away from his control. There was another photo taken in 2003. It was thought to be at the World Cup, but it wasn't, in fact. It was 2013, rather, and this was a football match, again, when Brazil was playing Spain, and this lady is searching for food in a dumpster as the crowds go by. So certainly a country with social and economic inequalities, and some photos do tend to put the spotlight on that. However, unfairly, they might caricature the situation.
All right, James Creedon, always there to sort the wheat from the chaff. A final point on this? Very briefly.
I find it funny that we might speak that there's a ghost of racial and social inequality, but because there's never been a ghost, it's very much alive for every black and every poor people in the country from ever since slavery. That's an issue that we haven't resolved also.
All right, I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you, James, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.